So the first couple minutes or first like 20 minutes or so, it's just going to be like a little lecture. And we're going to go through the tips and tricks that we think is best for you guys. And I also just wanted to start by saying I know that this process is really hard. And me and Abena were just talking about it, and I'm sure the other medical students here can agree. For me, I felt like it was an existential crisis, and I was like, how do I not know like why I want to go to medicine? Like I've been working for this for so long, but just know that it's very common to struggle with the personal statement. If you're a good writer or not, it's just a hard thing. And we're really here to help you guys. We're here to answer any questions. And we do have a free editing system where we have medical student volunteers that you can send us your personal statements and essays. So we'll have a link at the end of this presentation with that. If you have any questions while we go, just raise your hand, type in the chat, unmute. And then at the end of this, we're going to go into breakout rooms with different med students that so kindly offered to be here, and you can work on some brainstorming with them or ask any questions that you have. So Abena, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so that was Michaela speaking. I'm Abena, and we're the, I'm sorry, and we're the coordinators of the Application Essay Feedback Initiative. And so just a few disclaimers before we begin. These tips that you're going to be seeing throughout the presentation reflect our own ideas and are not to be taken as law. Please take them with an open mind and apply them to your own situation. We're also not part of any admissions committee, so we don't hold any sway over who gets admitted anywhere else and not in UCLA. And writing is very stylistic. Each person has a different approach, and all the medical students on this Zoom call will attest to this, that we all do things differently, but we're all here. And so it just goes to show that you can do things differently and you can make this process your own. You don't have to follow any formula.
So we're going to go over what the prompt of the personal statement is. These are 6 different tips that we have that we're going to go over. And then, like I said, at the end, we'll have some breakout rooms. You don't have to participate, but there is going to be a chance to possibly do a brainstorming activity, and then any questions that you have for our lovely medical students. And then if anyone has to leave early, we're going to send out, someone sent me a question. I thought it was a good question. The link for the essay editing will be sent out to Med Mentors. So we'll send out that link. So don't worry about getting it right now. So the prompt, which I didn't really know until like just before I started the application, but it's pretty much, why do you want to go to medical school? And it's 5,300 characters, which is about 760 to 1330 words. So the first tip is to know your message, which is honestly the hardest part of this whole thing. So you want to know what your theme is going to be and what you want the reader to take away, but more importantly, what you want them to feel. So typically, like when you remember like very impactful stories, it's not necessarily what they're telling you, but the emotions that the reader made you feel when they wrote the essay or the book or the movie. So keep that in mind, and that'll come up a bit later with some of the other tips. What I did personally is I got a big whiteboard and I just wrote out a bunch of different major events in my life and kind of tried to draw the connecting tie and message between all those. And in your breakout rooms, we'll work on a little activity that works at that. Another thing about displaying your message is to avoid cliches. We get a lot of essays, just kind of like, you know, a personal sick family member, which that's not a bad reason to go into medicine, but you just want to do so very genuinely and you want to make sure it doesn't sound too cliche. And you can always get feedback from me or Benna or the Med Mentor service. So feel free to use those topics, but just do so a little cautiously. And then last thing is just to be simple in your message. Don't have too many ideas, too many experiences. Just pick a couple things that you want the reader to feel at the end of your essay.
All right, the second tip is to know who you're writing to, and to just understand that the readers can be anyone, could be faculty, residents, deans, administrators, maybe even med students. And these readers are going to be looking through many, many applications a day. I think UCLA receives how many applications? What, over 10,000 applications? And so there's very high burnout. And so you do want to tailor your language to the audience so that they're not exhausted when like your essay doesn't, or your application doesn't fatigue them anymore. And so there are 3 E's that we want you to keep in mind when you, as you're writing your personal statement. The first E is to educate. So you want the reader to just simply understand your answer to the prompt. You also want to engage the reader. You want the reader to be able to stay attentive and curious throughout your while reading your essay. And then last, you want to entertain your reader. You want your reader to not struggle to get through. You want it to read very easily and smoothly. And also feel free to add as much of her personality as you can, and also add comic relief without, I guess, going overboard. Just some tasteful comedic sentences does help, especially when you're reading thousands and thousands of essays.
Sorry, I keep touching the slides. I'm not as Zoom savvy as you young millennials, but I'm trying my best. Okay, so tip number 3 is show, don't tell. From the essays that I've read, this is the most common thing that I see, and it's easily fixable. But again, you just want to make the experience like it's a story, and it's the part of your application that you can show personality. So a lot of times I'll read essays and it'll kind of just be telling me an experience. So an example of that would be, I worked in research and I learned the value of hard work. Well, you're kind of like telling me what you learned, but it's better to actually show it. So like a story, using descriptive words and different feelings or emotions. So this is an exercise that you can do to find the parts of your essay that are telling instead of showing. So this first part here, you can actually circle the words that are telling. For example, like, as I ran toward the door, I heard footsteps behind me. So heard could be expanded upon and described. And you can circle those words that are telling and turn them into showing. So instead of heard, you can write crunching, footsteps, shoes, shuffling. If you say like, I felt, you can say chills, goosebumps, breeze. And then the second part of the exercise is to circle different emotions. So I felt a chill of unease run down my spine. It was terrifying. So terrifying is kind of an emotional word. So let's actually write down the physical reaction to that emotion: sweating, heart beating, wide eyes, trembling. And so you can see here, after you kind of do some of these exercises, I'll just read you the before and after, and you can kind of see the difference. So before it was, as I ran toward the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I felt a chill of unease run down my spine. It was terrifying. Versus, as I hastened toward the door, crunch hitting my ears, crashing through the rampant thudding in my heart, unease slithered down my spine. So it's just a way to make your essay like really grab the reader. And as Abena mentioned, these people are reading so many essays. So the way that you describe these stories, you really want your reader to feel like they're in it.
All right, the fourth tip is to be specific. And so on here, we have an example of a very vague statement. So it says, through XYZ experience, I learned how to best serve patients. And honestly, I wrote something like this in my essays, and it was something that I had to switch out. But being more specific, you could say that I learned then that the true essence of patient-centered care was a balancing act between objective findings and what will ultimately best serve the patient. As my career in medicine expands, I will find myself faced with similar dilemmas, but I will uphold my strong ethical standard when caring for patients. So this is a little verbose, but the idea is to be as specific as possible. So rather than like leaving statements open to the reader, you want the reader to think what you want them to think. You don't want to have them come to their own conclusion. You kind of want to guide them by the nose a little bit. And so, yeah, just be as specific as possible.
Benna said it was verbose, but it was my personal statement. So obviously she doesn't like it. I'm just kidding. It doesn't matter to me. But anyways, this is something that I struggled with when I first wrote my essay. Like I would just be like, through this experience, I learned how to treat patients well. But it's like, okay, what does treating patients well mean? And this little picture here says some of the things you can do to just make it more specific. And like, you almost want the reader to believe what you're saying. You want to provide evidence for these claims that you're making. Like, I'm hardworking, I'm ambitious, I'm empathetic. Like, that's not enough. You need to be specific and say why exactly you are those things. So a way that you can do that is use names of people and places. You can give just a lot of detail. And the best thing I can recommend is to just use stories. Like, stories are the best way to really showcase who you are. And they're also a lot more interesting. So let the story kind of explain.
Okay. And again, Michaela, I do apologize, but this goes to show that personal statement writing is very stylistic. Michaela is here at UCLA. And so
God.
tip number 5 is to avoid repetitive I statements. And so although you want to emphasize that you're the one writing the statements, the essay, I think the point is already made when someone looks at your application. You don't have to like keep using I throughout your essay. And so yeah, that's just what it is. And so we have examples down here. I got to learn a lot about neuroscience, and rather than using that, you can start with neuroscience was a fascinating subject because, and the good thing about like not always using I statements is that you kind of vary your sentence structure a little bit. And so it helps to keep things very interesting for the reader. It's not, again, so boring and so it's not as unpolished. It could be more polished if you did take some of the I statements out. So yeah. Okay, and then tip number 6 is the hook, line, and sinker. And so this is just a way to just divide up the structure of your essay. And so the hook is your first sentence or paragraph, and this is where you make your first impression. And so ideally, this should be a very kind of strong statements that grabs the attention of the reader and instills their curiosity to keep on reading. And so you want to give some information, but you don't want to give too much. You do want to leave a little bit to write in your subsequent paragraphs. But you also don't want to go overboard or like exaggerate. You want it to be interesting, but you want it to also remain polished. The line would be your supporting paragraphs, and this can easily alter the impression that you've made in your hook. So you do want to, again, stay consistent with whatever ideas you've kind of brought out in your hook, and again, keep things interesting and so that you can maintain that emotional impact. And then the sinker is your last sentence, or I would say paragraph. And this is where you really make that lasting impression. And again, you want that to be consistent with your hook and line. And the thing about a lot of admissions committees is that when they discuss applicants in meetings, they will say, well, the applicant that did this, or the applicant who is like this, or whatever. And so basically your personal statements is your way of creating an interesting tagline for yourself so that you're very memorable. And when your name is brought up, like people know who you are, and it's easy to like discuss your experiences and why you'd be best fit for that particular institution.
Okay, so I'm just going to go off what Abena was saying. So I'm just going to give an example because I feel like that's the best way to understand this. But for example, for my essay, the first part of it was a story. And basically, I was explaining, I actually had like a sick parent, so I guess it was one of the more cliche stories, but it was the time that my mother was diagnosed with a mental illness. And so I like explained what that was like at the hospital and getting told that information. And then the line is kind of like your thesis or what you want the reader to take away from you. So it's basically a word at the end of that story that says why you wanted to go into medicine and what the skills are that you brought there. And then the sinker is kind of the thing that brings in all of your other stories back to that hook. So I hope that kind of made sense, and I'm happy to share my personal statement, and I'm sure Abena is too, if that's not making sense. One thing that we just want you guys to take away is this is not a resume. So your goal is not to just list 1,000 different activities. Keep in mind, you've already done your works and activities section, which lays out all of your activities. So this is just to get like personality. This is like your time to show like more than just kind of like facts. It's a way to show your personality. So we recommend just picking like 1 to 3, 4 at the most. It's really about the quality of the experiences and really diving deep into what you learned instead of the quantity. So just go through your statement when you're done and make sure that there's no more than 4. And some people have done 1, some people have done 2, some people have done 3. So yeah. Are you going, Abena? Oh, yes, you're going. Go.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
All right. And so yeah, just a little line about what Michaela was saying. I have read an essay where it was just like one experience, and that was one of the most powerful essays that I ever read. But I had like 2, and so the more you're able to draw out like those lessons learned and that emotional impact you had, the better. And you don't need a lot of experiences to really talk about that. Okay. So to summarize, tip number 1, know your message. Tip number 2, know your audience. Tip number 3, show, don't tell. Tip number 4, be specific. Tip number 5, avoid repetitive I statements. And then tip number 6, remember your hook, your line, and your sinker. All right. Michaela is going to take over from here, and I will set up the breakout rooms.
Awesome. So I'm going to send the link for the essay feedback. So for those who don't know, this is a free service where you can be paired up with someone to edit your essays to apply for medical school for free. And I also went to a UC, so I understand that it's a little hard not having like a pre-medical committee. So I really hope this is helpful for you guys.